Call this meeting of the Education Assessment Accountability Review Subcommittee to order. Clerk, please call the roll.
Senator Neal, Senator Titchener, Senator West, Representative Banto,
Present.
Representative Bojanowski,
Here.
Representative Riley, Co-Chair Truitt, Chair Deneen.
Here. Please silent your cell phones. If you have any cell phones, please silent them. All right, folks, all materials have been submitted to you electronically via email and will be available on the committee's LRC webpage. Any members have any special guests they would like to introduce at this time joining us today? All right, seeing none. We do not have a quorum at this moment, so we will hold off on approving of the last meeting's minutes. And hopefully we'll have someone come in here in a few minutes and we'll be able to do that later in today's committee meeting. At this time, we have the Office of Education Accountability report, an analysis of student discipline data in Kentucky schools on the agenda. Please come up to the table, take your seats. Please identify yourselves for the record. And you may begin when you are ready.
Ben Leo, researcher.
Chris Riley, OEA research analyst.
Allison Stevens, OEA Research Analyst.
Deborah Nelson, Research Division Director for Office of Education Accountability. And before we begin the report, I would just like to acknowledge that the report by design focuses on concerns about persistent and severe behavior issues. But if you look at the complete data in the report, especially Appendix A, which includes the principal data, this report could really have another title: Analysis of Student Discipline Data in Kentucky, glass way more than half full. The majority of principals report minor or little no concerns with school behavior, especially with school safety, and that's really a testament to the important work done by the department, Kentucky Center for School Safety, General Assembly, educators. So even though we are going to focus on some serious concerns of a substantial minority, wanted to provide that context before we begin.
Good morning. EARS requested that OEA's 2025 study agenda include an analysis of student discipline data to include trends across districts, schools, and student groups. The committee requested the report in light of the General Assembly's recent attempts to address concerns about persistent or severe student behavior challenges. Overall, the study finds that about 1 in 10 schools have major behavior-related challenges, while up to 1/3 have at least moderate challenges. Statutes that require or recommend certain disciplinary consequences for persistent or severe behaviors are not always implemented, and the consequences for some dangerous behaviors is sometimes minimal. Finally, the top challenges in addressing persistent or severe behavior challenges, as reported by principals, are federal limitations on disciplinary removals for students with disabilities and a lack of alternative placement options for students who struggle to learn in the traditional classroom. This presentation will begin with background on the report, including data used in policy context. We'll move on to look at the prevalence of behavior-related challenges, the implementation of statutes that address persistent or severe behaviors, and challenges facing schools in addressing those behaviors. This report focuses on the 2024 school year and includes an analysis of the Safe Schools dataset, through which the General Assembly mandates the reporting of behavior events. For reasons we will discuss, OEA urges caution in using only Safe Schools event data to draw conclusions about individual districts or schools. OEA's analysis included survey data from educators and students and data on student characteristics. In addition, OEA conducted site visits to 12 schools across the Commonwealth for which data indicated behavior-related challenges, and administered a survey to all A1 principals in the state. Finally, staff interviewed relevant KDE and KCSS staff and communicated findings prior to finalizing the report. Next, we'll take a look at policy context important for understanding data in the report. Related to key findings of the report, it is important to understand the tension that exists between the General Assembly's efforts to address persistent and severe behaviors and the federal government's focus on protecting individual students from disproportionate disciplinary removals. As directed by the General Assembly, discipline is primarily a locally controlled issue in the Commonwealth. Local boards must adopt a code of conduct that includes the types of behaviors expected from students and also the consequences for a failure to observe that code. The General Assembly does, however, provide specific directions on addressing certain persistent or severe behaviors and requiring or recommending removal of dangerous or seriously disruptive students from school or classroom settings. The federal government focuses on the rights of individual students, especially students with disabilities, providing legal protections against disproportionate removal from school or classroom settings unless certain conditions are met. Disciplinary removals for students with disabilities are limited to an accumulated 10 days. As noted in the report, these protections are a response to large-scale exclusion of many students with disabilities from general education in the not-so-recent past. Failure to observe federal law can result in audits or even the redirection of federal funds. Also influencing local leaders are national policy efforts discouraging exclusionary discipline generally, including its disproportionate effect on student subgroups. Kentucky data mirrors national data on disproportionate discipline for some groups. Local leaders must thus juggle sometimes conflicting messages that apply to situations in which an individual student is exhibiting dangerous or severely disruptive behaviors. In this next section, Chris will present data on behaviors that present the greatest challenges and the prevalence of these challenges in districts and schools.
All right, thank you, Ben. I'll begin by discussing the Safe Schools data that is the focus of the report. The General Assembly requires schools to record behavior events that are violations of the law. The law violations are grouped here by general categories in order of greatest to least prevalence in 2024. Schools must also enter every other event deemed to be serious by local boards. These are known as board violations. Board violations are also shown in order of prevalence by general categories. Board violations are only counted as behavior events if they result in one of 4 state-defined consequences, ranging from in-school removal to expulsion. Because districts have authority to determine consequences for these behaviors, they also have discretion on when behaviors that are board violations will be recorded in the Safe Schools data. While the statutory language focuses on the more serious events that are law violations, these law violations only accounted for 19% of the over 250,000 behavior events that were entered into the data in 2024, with the overwhelming majority of events being board violations. The 2 board violations at the top, those 2 board violation categories together comprised over 40% of all behavior events in 2024. Based in part on data from Site Visit Schools, OEA developed and administered a survey to all Kentucky principals to determine which types of behavior events are presenting the greatest challenge. The next series of slides provides insights from the survey that are not evident in Safe Schools behavior data alone. This slide shows the level of challenge reported by high school principals, with extreme or major challenges shown in dark and medium gray, and the moderate challenges shown in the lightest gray. Vapes, cell phone misuse, student apathy or disengagement, and tardiness are the top challenges in high schools across the state. Note that in the 2025 school year, the state's recent ban on cell phones during the instructional day had not yet gone into effect. Across all 3 school levels, weapons were not a concern for principals. At the middle school level, student apathy was the top issue reported, followed by vapes and cell phone misuse. Once again, concerns pertaining to violence, weapons, or drugs are relatively low for middle school principals. Concerns about extreme behavior in classrooms were much more common at the elementary level. Extreme behavior on the survey was described as throwing objects, overturning furniture, and screaming. Deb will discuss this concern in greater detail in the final section of the presentation. We're going to move now from looking at specific types of behavior events to the prevalence of behavior events generally, beginning at the state level. This slide shows that while it's not uncommon for students to have one or more behavior event recorded in the Safe Schools data, it is rare for students to have 5 or more behavior events. 14% of all students had at least one behavior event in 2024. As the table shows, students are more likely to have one or more board violation than a law violation. As the number of behavior events increase, the proportion of students drops substantially. Only 1 in 1,000 students had 20 or more behavior events in 2024. This is consistent with what we heard in site visit schools. Administrators typically reported far fewer than 10 students as presenting major and repeated behavior challenges, even in large high schools. Now let's look at how the prevalence of behavior events varies across districts. This figure shows the number of districts within each range, indicating the percentage of students that had one or more behavior event. As you'll recall from the last slide, the state average was 14% of students. And as you can see in the highest bar, many districts are close to that average. There is also a wide range in behavior events among districts, from less than 5% in 8 districts to 37% in 1 district. On average, as event rates increase, so do the percentages of students who are economically disadvantaged and who are not white. Now you would assume that the level of behavior challenge is greater in the districts to the right of this figure and less in the districts on the left. However, that is not necessarily true. OEA site visits revealed variation among schools in the thresholds, depending on the local code of conduct used to enter board violations into the student information system. OEA visited one school in which board violations were not entered into the system until a series of redirects and classroom removals had occurred, such that a particular behavior event might occur 15 times before being entered into the system. That school had a low level of behavior events in the system, but a high percentage of teachers reporting disruptions for student misconduct. In that school, the behavior event rate was a poor indication of behavior challenges in the classroom. To determine the general alignment of behavior event rates and behavior-related challenges statewide, staff compared district and school behavior event rates with teacher and student survey data related to behavior. For example, we looked at the relationship between the student event rates in each district and the percentage of educators who reported that student misconduct frequently disrupted the classroom learning environment. We found that on average, educators' reports of classroom disruptions from student misconduct do increase with behavior event rates. For example, an average of 11% of teachers in the lowest event rate group reported frequent classroom disruptions, compared with 48% of teachers in the highest group for which data were available. However, as with the example I gave in the previous slide, educators' reports of misconduct are often higher than what the event rate would suggest. And the reverse can also be true. In some schools with high behavior event rates, both teacher and student survey data indicate a relatively lower level of student behavior challenges. For this reason, based on data analyzed for the report, OEA urges caution in drawing conclusions about the level of behavior-related challenges in districts or schools based on event rate data alone. Event rate data, when combined with teacher and student survey data, provide a more accurate picture. Appendix H shows behavior event rate data, educator survey data, and student survey data for all districts in 2024. To estimate the proportion of districts and schools experiencing major behavior challenges relative to others in the state, OEA identified those for which challenges were indicated by all 3 data sources. These included 14% of districts and 7% of elementary schools, 13% of middle schools, and 8% of high schools. As OEA has noted in previous reports, school culture, climate, and student behavior is a cornerstone of effective districts and schools. Resources available through KDE and KCSS should proactively be shared with districts and schools for which data indicate behavior challenges. We'll move finally to look at what principals report about the level of behavior-related challenges in their schools. Like the data discussed on the previous screen, principal survey data also indicate that a relatively small minority of schools face major or extreme behavior-related challenges. OEA's 2025 survey asked principals to rate behavior-related challenges in 4 separate categories. Just over 1/3 of principals reported at least moderate concerns with behavior as it affects teaching and learning and staff morale, and 17% reported moderate concerns with school safety. The greatest level of concern reported by principals was with the demand placed on school resources by behavior-related challenges. Over 1/2 of the principals reported at least moderate concerns in that area. Allison will now look at the implementation of statutes that provide guidance to local boards in addressing consequences for dangerous events and students who are chronically disruptive in their classrooms.
Thank you, Chris. Statute requires expulsion or alternative placement for unlawful weapons and threats that pose a danger, but OEA found this occurred in a minority of cases. We also found that some of these events may not meet statutory definitions of unlawful weapons or threats that pose a danger, but the statute is not entirely clear. This table shows the disciplinary consequences associated with various weapon types in 2024 and whether students were, from right to left, expelled or placed in alternative placement, as directed by statute, suspended or removed within the school, or subject to a local resolution, meaning they did not receive any of the other consequences. It shows that 9.2% of all weapon events resulted in expulsion or alternative placement. Staff analysis indicates that most were suspended for a median of 3 days, but almost 20% were local resolutions, meaning the school took some other action. Examples in this case were detention or a phone call to a parent. It is unclear from the data, however, how many of these weapons events involved unlawful weapons. This is primarily because, as you can see in the table, knives were the majority of weapon events, and as I'll explain on the next slide, many knives may not meet the statutory definition of unlawful weapons. However, firearms are clearly defined as unlawful weapons in statute, and of the 27 firearms, 44% resulted in expulsion or alternative placement. 3 statutes address knives in school. In some, statute prohibits unlawful weapons on school property, which includes any firearm or other deadly weapon, and the definition of deadly weapon includes any knife other than an ordinary pocket knife or hunting knife. It is unclear from the data which of the knives were ordinary pocket knives or hunting knives, and it's also unclear why hunting knives might be less dangerous for a student to possess on school property than some other kind of knives. This leads us to recommendation 3.1. In short, if the General Assembly wants districts to receive direct guidance on weapons, it should consider amending KRS 158-150 to require the KDE and the KCSS to collaborate and clearly define unlawful weapons. We'll now take a look at consequences for threats. Like weapons, threats that pose a danger require expulsion or alternative placement per statute, but few threats resulted in these resolutions, particularly threatening another student or staff at less than 2% and 3% respectively. It is not clear which of these threats meet statutory conditions for expulsion or alternative placement. Statute requires clear and convincing evidence that threats are a danger to the well-being of others. In other words, it depends on the context. As described in the report, schools are required to carry out a threat assessment process by which staff determine the degree of real threat, but the result of threat assessments are not indicated in the data. Wanton endangerment, by definition, does provide a threat, however. It is defined as wantonly engaging in conduct which creates a substantial danger of physical injury. And a minority of these events resulted in expulsion or alternative placement. This leads us to recommendation 3.2, which is similar to 3.1. In short, if the General Assembly should consider amending KRS 158-150 to require the KDE and the KCSS to clarify threats which pose a danger. I will now turn to assaults. Statutes require disciplinary actions up to and including expulsion for students who physically assault school staff or students, and reporting of all such incidents. As we'll see on the next slide, few assaults resulted in expulsion or alternative placement, and in some cases, consequences were minimal. Fewer than 10% of students who committed any assault were expelled or received alternative placement, even for first-degree assault, which is the most serious type of assault because, by definition, it results in an injury that puts the victim at risk of death. In addition, more than 1/4 of first-degree assaults resulted in a local resolution, which in this case included conference with a student or a phone call to a parent or loss of privileges. On site visits to several schools, staff reported being upset by the minimal consequences to students following assault on staff or security officers. In one case, a student who committed an assault that required medical attention returned to school the next day. OEA was unable to determine the number of assaults on staff from the Safe Schools data. Although the software is capable of identifying victims, this information was not recorded. This leads us to recommendation 3.3. In short, if the General Assembly intended that staff, students, or other groups be identifiable in the data for incidents of violence, it should consider amending KRS 158-444 to require that victims be identified in the Safe Schools data reporting. The report also looked at implementation of legislation addressing chronic disruption. Chronically disruptive students are students who have been removed from the same classroom 3 times within 30 days. Principals may suspend them on no other basis and can permanently remove them from the classroom for the rest of the year to another classroom or to an alternative setting, which can be virtual. On the OEA Principal Survey, 1/3 of principals reported having policies, procedures, or practices for chronically disruptive students. Over half of these principals identified between 1 and 5 students as chronically disruptive in 2025, while about 1/5 identified 0 students, despite having the policies in place. Principals in 5 schools identified more than 15 students, with 1 reporting 42 chronically disruptive students. This slide shows the percentage of principals reporting use of each of the alternative placement options at least once. The most common consequence for common disruption was suspension, although a variety of options were used, including placement in another classroom, in virtual school, or in alternative school. We did ask about chronic disruption in our site visit schools. As a reminder, all of these schools were identified for site visits because data indicated behavior challenges. Teachers in most site visit schools expressed frustration with a lack of consequences for classroom disruption, especially when extremely disruptive students were briefly removed from class before returning, often with a snack. None of the 12 site visit schools were implementing chronic disruption policies or had been approached by district administrators about such policies. One principal stated that he believed most principals in his district were not aware of the legislation. Deb will now look at challenges facing schools generally in addressing student behavior. These challenges also apply to implementation of chronic disruption policies.
Thanks, Allison. I'll begin by taking a quick look at the top 3 options that principals reported on our survey that were highly or extremely needed in promoting positive student behavior, especially mental health supports and parent support for student discipline. While not a focus of the report, both were frequently mentioned by site visit interviewees and in comments of survey respondents, which you can see in Appendix B of the report. We'll discuss options permitted for students with IEPs in upcoming slides. The final recommendations of the report focus on the challenges identified by principals in addressing persistent and severe behavior once it occurs. This figure shows that the majority of principals reported at least moderate challenges related to federal limitations on disciplinary removals for students with disabilities, and almost 4 in 10 principals reported major or extreme challenges with these limitations. In addition, most reported a lack of alternative instructional settings generally, not just for students with disability, as a barrier to addressing serious problems. We'll first focus on the first, alternative settings. Many site visit educators described a desire for alternative placements located at the school, not as a consequence for misconduct, but as a way of assisting students to be successful when they were struggling to learn in the regular classroom, therefore preventing misbehavior. Statewide, this need was greatest at the elementary and middle school levels. More than 4 in 10 elementary principals identified lack of alternative instructional settings as a major or extreme need. The need at elementary school reflects, in part, lack of alternative settings available in elementary schools, but also, as Chris noted earlier, the much higher percentage of elementary schools compared with middle and high schools that are experiencing challenges with students having difficulty regulating extreme behavior. These behaviors were reported most frequently in the early grades, as early as pre-kindergarten, for students who are really experiencing challenges adapting to the school environment. On site visits, we learned that the severity of this behavior often requires schools, for safety reasons, to clear the classroom of the disruptive child. This involves removing the teacher and other students until trained school staff come to remove the disruptive child. Survey data show that classroom clears are much more common at the elementary than other school levels. As you can see in the light gray bar, almost 3/4 of elementary schools reported at least one student that required a classroom clear, and almost 1/3 in the darker gray bar reported at least one student that required 5 or more classroom clears. Survey comments in Appendix B of the report, as well as site visit interviews, indicated great distress of teachers and students related to these situations where there are many classroom clears in an individual classroom, sometimes leading parents to remove their students from public schools, the other students. OEA did hear about one district that has developed a school-based alternative program to assist these types of students in becoming acclimatized to the school, but it appears that strategies are lacking in many schools. For this reason, we recommend that the Kentucky Department of Education collaborate with the Kentucky Center for School Safety and other relevant organizations to identify promising practices in Kentucky schools or nationally related to school-based instructional settings or alternative programs for students whose behavior interrupts the learning or learning of others, with special attention to elementary schools. We'll turn finally to discuss challenges associated with federal thresholds on disciplinary removals. Before beginning that discussion of this complex issue, we'll note that, as stated earlier, federal law is in place for a reason. In addition, students with repeated behavior challenges are a small minority of students with disabilities, though students with disabilities are disproportionately responsible for some of those more extreme events that Allison discussed. Conversations about this issue can be difficult, but the strong concern of so many principals about unintended consequences of the law merit attention. As described in detail in the report, many educators expressed strong concern about what they perceived as the effects of federal thresholds in some cases. Many site visit interviews describe situations in which administrators ceased to discipline students with disabilities when disciplinary removals exceeded a certain number in order to avoid hitting that 10-day threshold. Although processes are in place to allow disciplinary removals after that 10-day threshold, administrators have described that it's very difficult to meet those thresholds, and so therefore they avoid those processes. This can create extremely disruptive or even unsafe conditions. Site visit interviewees and survey respondents express the sentiment that in these situations, the rights of the teachers and other students are sacrificed for the rights of the disruptive student. And some educators noted that the federal limitations can even have negative consequences for students with disabilities themselves, who are not given the opportunity to understand the consequences they will face once out of the side of the school setting with some of these extreme behaviors. It's unclear from the data, however, whether the problems reported by principals are a necessary consequence of the law or the way that it is being implemented in particular schools and districts. On this survey question related to the legal restrictions associated with federal law, almost 4 in 10 principals reported minor or little challenge. It may be that those principals did not have any severely challenging students in their schools, but it also may be because the policies were being implemented differently in their districts and schools. So here we'll discuss some factors affecting implementation of the law. First, KDE notes variation among districts in the degree to which they implement federal requirements that a continuum of alternative placement options be available outside of the regular classroom. These might include resource rooms or pull-out services. And in the absence of these alternatives, it may be that the only options available are the regular classroom or some type of disciplinary removal. In addition, we note variation among districts in support for alternative placement, with 20% of district administrators actively discouraging it. Reluctance to discipline students in some cases because of perceived threats of legal challenges from parents. Variation in the degree to which administrators understand their options under the law. And finally, lack of clarity in some cases about what KDE considers appropriate for disciplinary removals. Return to this point with the slide that Ben provided earlier, really discussing some tension between the desire of the General Assembly to have those persistent and severe behaviors addressed and some of the federal protections. KDE is charged by the federal government with enforcing implementation of federal law related to those disciplinary removals, and failure to enforce that law would result in loss of funding for the Commonwealth. So as a condition of that funding, the department must annually collect discipline data for students on a variety of metrics, and based on the data, conduct reviews or audits of district policies and practices. We know that administrators take action to avoid these audits, and in some cases may not put in place practices that are allowable under the law if they perceive that these practices would be found to be out of compliance. Site visit interviewees indicated a desire for clear guidance about the full range of options available under the law to allow them to address persistent or severe disciplinary issues. This leads us to our final set of recommendations. First, that KDE should solicit data from educators about challenges they are experiencing under federal law as it relates to addressing these persistent or severe behaviors of students with disabilities. Data collection should include questions about continuum of placements, challenges related to legal threats, and any questions about what is strictly required by federal law related to what must be counted as a disciplinary removal and included in data collection to fulfill federal requirements. By August 29th of 2026, KDE should submit findings of its data collection to EARS and the Interim Joint Committee on Education, and findings may include any observations of the department related to areas of confusion in the law and any training that should be provided to district or school administrators. And finally, based on finding of its data collection and any feedback from the General Assembly, KDE should develop guidance documents and training to assist educators in understanding their options and responsibilities under federal law to prevent and address persistent or severe behavior challenges of students with disabilities, examples of disciplinary removals that may be carried out without counting towards the time accumulated towards a change of placement under federal law. That concludes our presentation. We'd be happy to answer questions about the presentation or any data in the report.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Several things very eye-opening, I think, and I would like further explanation on. Protecting the instructional environment is paramount for the success of our students. The chronic disruptive behavior challenges need to be addressed, and we have to. We can't look away. We cannot sometimes ignore these relevant disruptions. I hear from teachers all the time, not administrators, but teachers, that the classroom disruptions sometimes are unreported. And according to your report, that is the case, because they, for whatever reason, may feel like those reporting those disruptions on a regular basis may reflect negatively on the school or the leadership of the school or the district, and lead to potential issues with federal law in trying to deal with it. So the lack of proper reporting issues by schools really causes a lot of miscued data on your behalf, and it makes it very difficult for us as legislators to narrow in and focus on how we can help if we don't have that proper data. So I do appreciate your recommendations on how that data should be reported, and I look forward to probably looking into ways that we can get KDE to participate in helping us get better data on those areas.
Senator Deneen, just want to clarify one issue about the data, and everything that you said about our presentation is true. In regards to districts that may have multiple events before it is reported in the data, we want to clarify that's not under the current law a problem with data reporting, because it would be if it was a law violation. If it's a law violation, it should be reported. We do know in some cases
these are board.
Yes, and even with the law violations, what you said is true. We were at a school where a classroom teacher explained to us there's someone who just got jacked up down the hall, and I guarantee that's not going in the behavior event right data. So that is a violation of the law when law violations are not reported. The board violations, that's not really a problem with the data. That just reflects the fact that disciplinary decisions are locally controlled, and what might be considered very serious in some districts or merit immediate consequences are just handled differently. So currently it's not a problem with what in some cases it is, like with the law violation, but in others, say take profanity. Maybe there's some schools where the first time that happens, it's reported in the system. But that may be really unrealistic. In other places, you'd spend all of your first day reporting all of the middle school students.
Right.
And so it would be difficult to say all of these incidents need to be reported. Administrators would just be in the office the whole time, rather than, and we heard the example of a school resource officer walking down the hall and say, hey, we need to cut that out, in the first few days of school. And really, so some of that is just local decisions.
Correct. That's left up to the board, those local decision makers. There was a statement made in your report that principals reported resource challenges that were expressed, specifically expressed by these principals. Along those lines, can you elaborate just a little bit on specific resource challenges that they may have mentioned? Was that relating to having an alternative school to deal with those situations, or having a policy in place? What resources specifically can you, if any, were provided to you?
I'm going to start, and then staff, if I leave anything out, please jump in. So one is administrator time. That's a huge resource. If you have a principal and a vice principal whose job it is, primarily to look after the entire school and improve instruction and do all of these things. And we visited one school where they had a handful of students that were so disruptive, screaming all the time. We had an incident while we were there, and the student was underneath the cafeteria table, and the vice principal was in with us, had to leave. And, in some schools they report 90% of administrator time devoted to a small number of students. So that's a resource challenge right there. If you look at vapes, and that was the top concern reported by high schools, there's a lot of resources invested in, the vape detection, If it's a THC vape and they need to figure out what to enter into the system, they need to send that off to a lab. So just dealing, weapons detection systems, vape detection systems, those are resources. Certainly alternative settings, that's a big one. That in a large high school, large district, you may have multiple opportunities of where to place students. But if it's a very, if it's a small district or a small school and you have one or two very disruptive students, you really can't afford to have staff, or sometimes they can't. And so when you do need to put in place staff to handle, we had one report of one student that needed 2 staff. That student was so dangerous to be, it was an elementary school student. So, vape detections, weapons detection, administrator time, staff, aides to handle those severe disruptions. Am I leaving anything out, Mr. John?
I appreciate that answer because that kind of leads me into this next question that I have. And then we'll get into, I have some colleagues that have questions as well, and maybe their questions will be answered with this question. In your report, you stated that less than half of the deadly weapons violations have resulted in expulsions or alternative placement. Less than half. That's concerning. Very concerning. What that states is that type of behavior is going unaccountable. They're not being held accountable for that. And that creates a danger to not only students, but to staff and to the learning environment ultimately. So it leads me to this question. What data or feedback did you all get from principals regarding the effectiveness or assistance they may have received from their local juvenile justice systems in dealing with some of those chronic violations like that? In your report, did you get any feedback from those principals on how they're working with juvenile justice system in their counties, in their regions, in their areas to address and deal with some of those students with extreme discipline issues?
So this is a little bit about, we did hear some things. I may not use the exact right language here. So anyone, you may have comments from other people. That wasn't a question we specifically asked. It is a question on the survey about, in some districts, discouraging, discouraging criminal reporting of some of these behaviors. So this is what we did here, and this is similar to things that we hear in other reports. Sometimes it can depend on the local judge and local officials and how they are handling things, so it varies across the state. The concern that we did for sure here is an element, number one, there's data in the report showing that in some cases, principals are not always notified when they have someone in their school who has broken the law. There's been a criminal violation that is supposed to be reported by court designated workers, the police, correct. And I think there's something like 30% of high school principals, 2030, that said that they have students for whom that is not reported. So there are systems in place there that they're not always being reported. Another major issue, and this came out somewhat in site visits, but more in surveys, is that elementary school students, the statute discourages disciplinary removals except in extreme cases. But even in those extreme cases, like with assaults, and I don't know the law here, but we did get a number of comments saying that they cannot prosecute students under 12 years old. Now, this sounds extreme, that you would even prosecute a student under 12 years old but I think the reason that they state this is that in some cases, going back to that parent accountability piece, if you have a student who is extremely violent and disruptive and they haven't been able to work with the parents, that the only thing that will get the attention is to report through the criminal justice system. And so I think that varies among districts, the extent to which that does. And we did have one survey comment, a positive comment, saying our local system, works with us on that.
So
And they
you-
kind of tag team. And then in others saying, we really have our hands tied with some of these students under 12. And in the data that Chris showed earlier for elementary schools, you can see student to staff violence, although it's a small concern for most principals, it's actually greatest at the elementary school.
Correct.
And I think that just reflects there's more alternative placements generally once students get to the high school level. That's why you're hearing some of these fewer concerns, but there's less in place at the elementary school. And this is really where, and you wouldn't think it from looking at the data, but this is really where some of the challenges for which there is no current solution are happening.
I just wanted to clarify that the communication between your CDWs and your court systems in dealing with those that are, of course, above 12 and older is critical. It's critical in helping the schools be aware of students that may have a history of that type of chronic behavior. And I just wanted to try to figure out if you found that consistently being reported across the board like that bridge is so very important as we try to figure out ways to address the issues. So thank you for that. At this time, we've got a couple of other questions. I apologize for dominating the questions out front, but there was just a lot of things that stood out to me, and I wanted to take that liberty as chair. So, Representative Bojanowski.
All right, thank you. So, great report, very informational, and I would agree that teachers probably would declare that there's much more of a problem with behavior than some of the reporting shows. One point that I'm dealing with actively with a family is on that continuum of alternative placements. There was no discussion about residential placements. And what I've met with multiple families, and I'm actively trying to help one, is that we have students with severe behavioral issues whose behavior is so severe that it's not safe for them to live at home with their families. And in order for these students to gain access to a residential placement in this state, the parents are being told that they have to give up custody to the child to the state because the agencies will not accept children with severe behaviors. So that just kind of at the top with our most severe. So one of these children I'm working with is in a building in a special class, but not an alternative school. But that behavior then triggers all the others, and it holds places from kids moving through that system. And so I just think we have a major issue with children whose behaviors are so severe that the professionals, the families, they need that residential option. And to say that they have to give up custody of their children to the state is just abhorrent. So I'm not sure if you have any information about that, but I did want to make that point.
Our report did not go that far.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. You all do an excellent job. Every year it's the same. It's very detailed, very well put together, and I want to thank you for your good work here on this again. A couple quick questions on alternative placement. Did you state in your presentation, I may have missed it, but were there several locations that did not have alternative placement facilities? Did I hear that right?
Many, and we actually have data on that in the report. Let's see. I believe there's summary data in Chapter 4. Table 4.1. Now that shows the availability of alternative placement, different ones. And then we have more information on that in the appendix. What it doesn't show is who doesn't have any of these options. We could get that for you easily if you would like to see it. So, for example, yeah.
So for clarification, kind of where I'm headed with this question, please do that if you could. These are required by federal law, is that correct?
Well, yes, they are, but I think on behalf of it, superintendents, local boards, I would say this is an unfunded mandate. If you are a very small district or a very small school and you have one student that needs it, your options are going to be fewer than if you're a very large district and
Sure.
you can.
Yeah.
So it is required, but I'm not sure that, and a
Yeah.
full continuum
Yeah.
is just not one alternative placement. It's also different types of behavioral supports. And so that would be the ideal world. But I think when it's not in place, I would say it's not necessarily because people are flaunting the law, but they may not have the resources.
It's impossible for them to do it.
Yes.
And it's obviously there are districts where it's honestly not that big a deal, right? For much smaller districts, they can handle what they have and it's okay. But for some larger districts, they may not have alternative placement. It's a serious issue, correct?
It may be the opposite, Senator West, that in the larger districts, because of economies of scale, there are. Now, sometimes we find that those places exist, but placement of students in those is discouraged, so that happens. But I think a small district is okay if it doesn't have any severely disrupted students, but a small district that maybe has a few challenges, they because of economies of scale, they may also struggle. And if you look in the appendix and you see the districts that are kind of high across the board in challenges, many of them are very small districts, and I don't know if that's a resource issue coming from a few
Sure, yeah.
a few students, but I wouldn't say that it is not a problem with small districts. It would depend on the students in those districts.
Correct. I agree. And second question, Mr. Chairman. So this will
Yes,
be
go
quick.
ahead.
In your discussions with principals, did the fair team issue come up? Was there any discussion of the fair teams and how it might be that's a barrier to alternative placement or getting these discipline issues out of the classroom? Did that arise at all?
That was a prompt on one of our questions. We asked about barriers. We didn't ask them, is this a barrier? But, we asked about barriers, and then we could run through or say, were any of these? And that wasn't one that popped out in those 12 site visit schools.
Got it. Thank you.
We have heard that previously, but not in this study.
Got it. Thank you.
Senator Tishner.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your work on this. It's really impressive to see what OEA is able to pull together with all the collection of data that you work on. Couple of things. The classroom clears. Is this a policy that came about because of the federal restrictions around disciplining IEP students? Or do you have a little bit of history of the policy and procedures around classroom clears? It seems like a very backwards way to address a discipline issue when it is being caused by one student and then the whole class is removed. Do you have any history on that?
What you said, that sentiment is definitely true, and it is my impression that things have changed, but we didn't look into that, and that would be something that I think staff from the department could help with any changes over time in federal law. I think there have been some, with restraints and seclusions, and I know when I was a teacher, I never heard of this, so something has changed, but of the whole classroom being cleared rather than the student. I don't know what the change is, and I don't know whether it stems from federal law, but I'm sure that's something that department staff can help you understand.
Thank you. I would like to look a little further into that. Do you mind if I ask another question? The expulsions, I haven't obviously had much time to look through the whole report. Do you have listed out expulsions? I know previously in the district data profile, there would be listed the number of suspensions in a district and expulsions, and the expulsions was removed from the data. Did you all bring that back in this discipline study?
We don't have it by district. We did look at it at the state level for about 4 different categories. But no, we don't have it by district the way it would be in the profiles.
Is there a reason that was removed from the data profiles?
Yes, it's because no, we can always get you those data, Senator Tishner, and we also have an online version where it's easier to report this. There's a few issues. One is, I'm looking for the number. I think there's about 200 expulsions statewide, and most districts don't have one. So it'd be a 0. Then some districts would have a really small number. Not sure about the reporting issues if you report just 1 or 2 students. And so the reason it's not in the profile is because most districts don't have one. And then we are not sure about numbers as far as that those are data we can get you. And we certainly can discuss inclusion in the profiles. I'm not sure about the rules around it. And because most districts don't have any, I'm assuming, or many districts don't have any. That would be one of the reasons. But we are in possession of the entire data set, and thank you for the Senator West and I here, but the compliment on the data analysis, which is really these guys sitting to the side of me. We can get you, and summarize to the extent possible with end counts any information you need from the Senate. We're very well set up to do this now that we've done this report. And we can all, you can discuss with the co-chairs inclusion in the profiles, especially in the online version. We do have to pay attention to those end count issues.
Okay. And thank you. I appreciate that. I'll probably reach out. One more, if you don't mind. Thank you so much. There are some changes coming, obviously, at the Department of Education, and there have been a couple of executive orders specific to discipline issues. Were you able to separate schools that are under a plan through the Office of Civil Rights regarding disparate discipline based on race? Were you able to break apart any of that data or collect any survey information on discipline issues within schools that might be under a plan through the Office of Civil Rights?
We didn't formally look at that. I will tell you that this is an issue that has come up, that there's reluctance to discipline students with disabilities. Then there may also be issues with districts if they're under that type of investigation. And we didn't disaggregate that way by the report, but that is certainly something. And as we note in Chapter 1, federal law protects students with disabilities, but not only students with disabilities. Whenever there's been an issue, whenever districts has been audited, then that is something they desire to avoid, and actions are taken.
Okay, thank you.
Not always intended actions. There could be positive actions. It could lead to people really trying to understand what's going on here, and I hope that happens, but there are also the type of unintended consequences that we talked about.
Right, thank you.
Are there any other questions from committee members at this time? All right, I'd like to thank our presenters for an outstanding presentation, and thank you for collecting the data and analyzing that data. It's much appreciated, and I hope that we can put together some things to come about through your recommendations that may lead to better reporting and to better classroom behavior ultimately, and better learning environments. So thank you all very much. At this time, we have a review of administrative regulations. I believe that there is an administrative regulation on the agenda that everybody was sent. This is basically a grammatical cleanup. It is nothing major, but we do not have a quorum at this time. But if those folks that the agency can come up to the table, would please identify yourself for the record, and you may begin.
Good morning. Todd Allen, Deputy Commissioner and General Counsel for KDE.
Matthew Courtney, Policy Advisor, Kentucky Department of Education.
And Senator, as you indicated, the amendments to this regulation are to comply with House Bill 298 from the 2025 session. There were a few changes there that we needed to make in order to comply with that statute. Just as a reminder, both federal and state law require the department to have procedures to implement a school intervention process for certain schools that fall below certain thresholds in our accountability system, and that's what this regulation does. Happy to answer any questions.
Seeing no questions at this time, although we do not have a quorum, what this will take place is that we'll move forward and we'll eventually go before the IJCE. And if we take no actions here, it will be moved on forward and approved. So thank you all for your presentation. If there's no further questions, I accept a motion for adjournment. We have no other further business before this committee.
So moved.
We are adjourned.